Welcome back. I was going through this particular script and kept returning to one detail. The protagonist never fights the theft of her trust fund. She lets it happen. That calculated stillness, choosing to appear powerless while quietly building a nine-figure company, is a form of warfare most people never recognize until the damage is irreversible. Right here on Eternal Diary. The elevator smelled like someone else's perfume. That was Vivian Shen's first coherent thought when awareness flooded back into her body, not the cold tile pressing against her cheek, not the distant ringing in her ears, not even the fact that she was lying on the floor of her own penthouse bathroom at what appeared to be 2 a.m. It was the perfume. Floral, heavy. The kind Diana always wore, the kind that clung to furniture and curtains and the backs of chairs long after Diana herself had left the room, as though she was marking territory with scent the way certain animals marked it with sound. Vivian pushed herself upright with her palms flat on the tile. Her wrist shook. Her vision swam and then settled. The overhead light flickered twice before holding steady, and she sat there on the floor in the circle of its pale yellow glow, breathing. She was 31 years old. No, she had been 31 years old. The knowledge settled over her slowly, the way cold water settles when you lower yourself into a bath, inch by inch, not all at once, your body cataloging each new sensation with a kind of dumb animal precision. She was not 31. She was 23. She was 23, and it was the 3rd week of October, and tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, her father Leonard Shen was scheduled to meet with his estate attorney to formally amend the distribution clause in her trust fund. She knew this because she had lived it once before. She had been 23 the first time, and she had not known about the meeting until 2 months after it happened, when she found a single paragraph buried in a stack of documents her stepmother's secretary had accidentally forwarded to the wrong email address. By then, the amendment had already been filed. By then, the clause that gave the co-trustee, Diana Shen, formerly Diana Caldwell, discretionary access to the principal balance had already been quietly inserted into the language of a document that Vivian's grandfather had spent 3 years of his life constructing specifically to protect his granddaughter from exactly this kind of maneuver. By then, it had been too late. Vivian sat on the bathroom tile and let the memories come back in the particular way they come back when a person has spent 8 years trying to suppress them. Not all at once, not like a flood, but in precise and surgical fragments. The way Marcus had looked at her from across the conference table the morning he handed her the dissolution papers for their company. The exact quality of light in Celia's eyes at the charity gala, that particular shade of triumphant pity, when she'd appeared on Leonard's arm and accepted the applause of 300 people who believed she was the Shen family's real success story. The specific sound of a courtroom door closing when the judge had finished reviewing Vivian's petition to contest the trust amendment and found it insufficiently documented. The sound of the document filing fee being declined because the account it had been drawn from, her account, the operating account for the company she had spent 4 years building, had been frozen pending the outcome of a financial fraud investigation that Marcus had filed 6 days prior using fabricated transaction records and a corporate attorney Vivian had once personally recommended to him. She remembered all of it. She sat on the tile floor of her 23-year-old bathroom and she felt the weight of it. 8 years of being surgically dismantled by people who smiled at her across dinner tables. And she did not feel grief. She had already grieved. She had grieved until there was nothing left but the clean, fine-edged residue of a very specific kind of anger. The kind that does not burn hot but stays at a constant cool temperature. The kind you can carry in your chest for years without it consuming you, because it has already finished its transformation into something else entirely. It had transformed into strategy. She stood up. Her legs held. She walked to the sink and turned the cold water on and held her wrists under the tap for 30 seconds, watching the water run over her skin. Her reflection looked back at her from the medicine cabinet mirror. Young, clear-eyed, 23 years old, and standing in a penthouse that still belonged entirely to her, in a body that had not yet had the luxury of being worn down by 8 years of sustained, coordinated betrayal. She turned the water off. She dried her hands on the towel hanging nearest the door, which was white and neatly folded and smelled of the laundry service that delivered every Tuesday, and she walked into the bedroom and sat down on the edge of the bed and picked up her phone from the nightstand. 3:14 a.m., Tuesday, October 22nd. She had until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. She set the phone back down and stared at the far wall for a moment, and then she did something that would have alarmed anyone who had known her in the life she had just lived. She smiled. Not warmly, not with relief or vindication or any of the large performative emotions that this moment seemed designed to produce. It was a quiet smile, barely a movement of the mouth, the kind of expression a chess player makes when they realize they can see 16 moves ahead of their opponent, and their opponent has not yet registered that a game is being played. Then she got up and went to the kitchen and made herself a cup of coffee, cheap instant, the kind she kept for late nights, the kind that tasted like burnt rubber and resolve, and she sat down at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and started writing. Leonard Shen had 3 qualities that his daughter had cataloged with clinical precision long before she understood what cataloging meant. He was not a cruel man, he was not a dishonest man, and he was constitutionally incapable of saying no to women who cried in his presence. This was not a character flaw in any ordinary sense. Leonard's capacity for empathy was genuine. His desire to make the women around him feel secure and valued was real, rooted in a childhood that had been administered by a cold and largely absent mother, and shaped by the loss of Vivian's own mother. Elaine, quiet and brilliant and dead at 37 of an aneurysm that arrived without warning on an otherwise unremarkable Thursday afternoon, when Vivian was 9 years old and Leonard was 40, and both of them were, in their respective ways, completely unprepared for the particular kind of grief that comes from losing the person who was holding the architecture of your life together. Diana Caldwell had walked into his life 2 years later at a benefit dinner for a children's hospital foundation. She was 41, recently divorced, and possessed of a specific social fluency that Leonard, whose wealth came from manufacturing and whose personal style ran toward technical precision rather than personal warmth, had found immediately compelling. She knew how to enter a room. She knew how to make a man feel that his intelligence was rare, that his company was coveted, that the particular combination of his qualities was something she had been waiting specifically to encounter. She had a daughter from her first marriage, Celia, 19, already studying at the design school downtown on what Diana described as a partial scholarship, and what was actually, as Vivian had eventually discovered, a deferral of tuition that Diana was navigating with the determined creativity of someone who had been managing financial precarity for several years, and had developed considerable skill at making that precarity invisible. Leonard and Diana married 14 months after the benefit dinner. Vivian had been 12 years old, standing in a garden in a pale blue dress that she'd chosen herself because no one had asked her what she wanted, watching the ceremony with the particular expressionlessness of a child who has decided that showing feelings is more dangerous than containing them. She had been right, as it turned out, just not about Diana. About herself. Because Vivian had spent the first 8 years of her adult life being too contained, too careful, too convinced that if she simply continued to perform competence, if she graduated top of her class, if she launched a company that posted 8-figure revenues by its 4th year, if she kept her trust fund documents in careful order and her relationships in careful balance, the machinery that Leonard and Diana had quietly constructed around her would remain theoretical, a potential, a future problem she was perpetually one step ahead of. She had been wrong. The machinery had not been theoretical. It had been patient. Now, sitting at her kitchen table at 3 a.m. with a cup of cooling instant coffee and a yellow legal pad, Vivian understood the specific nature of her error. She had been playing defense. She had been so focused on protecting what she had that she had never taken a single moment to consider what it might look like to destroy what they were building. She picked up her pen and began to write 2 columns on the legal pad. The left column she labeled assets. The right column she labeled vectors. Assets, the trust fund itself, $18 million in a structure her grandfather Wallace Shen had established with considerable legal sophistication in 1998, designed for a 30-year distribution window with a principal protection clause and a specific co-trustee designation that named her father as the primary trustee and, this was the part Diana had exploited, gave the surviving spouse of the primary trustee contingent co-trustee powers in the event of Leonard's incapacity or death. Leonard had never updated the designation after marrying Diana. Wallace Shen's attorney had flagged it as a potential vulnerability in a letter to Leonard in 2009, letter that Leonard had filed and apparently not read with sufficient attention. Assets continued. Her apartment, which she owned outright, purchased with the first distribution from the trust at age 21. Her education, 3 years of financial analysis at the business school downtown, which she had attended on the strength of a full merit scholarship because Leonard had offered to pay, and she had declined, sensing even then that accepting money from Leonard meant accepting the conditions attached to it. Her network, which was modest at 23 but real. 2 professors who had offered to write references for any professional endeavor she chose to pursue, a handful of former internship colleagues, and 1 specific contact. Dorian Kwan, a year ahead of her in the program, now working as a junior associate at one of the city's mid-sized corporate law firms, who had called her last week about a project he was working on and who she had not yet called back. Assets continued. 8 years of future knowledge about how Diana and Celia and Marcus operated, the precise sequence of the traps they set, the exact documents they would later need and fail to have, the specific moments at which they had overplayed their hands, and the moments at which she, in her first life, had failed to capitalize. She underlined that last entry 3 times. The vectors column took longer to fill. She wrote, "Tomorrow morning's trust meeting." Under that, the amendment to the co-trustee clause. Under that, the financial mechanism by which Diana would eventually gain discretionary access to the principal and deploy it toward funding Celia's fashion label, which would launch with considerable fanfare in 3 years and collapse in 18 months under the weight of mismanaged production contracts and a brand strategy that had been built entirely on Vivian's family name without Vivian's authorization. She wrote, "Marcus Hale." Under that, she allowed herself 1 moment of pure cold feeling. Not grief, not anger, just a clear-eyed acknowledgement of the specific quality of that particular betrayal before she continued writing. She listed the joint venture they would form, the revenue attribution dispute, the fabricated transaction records, the frozen accounts. She listed the specific law firm Marcus would use and the specific attorney within that firm who had a relationship with Diana's divorce attorney from her first marriage and who would not, therefore, be a neutral party regardless of how he presented himself. She wrote, "Celia." She wrote the name and then paused and thought about Celia, who was not malicious in the way that Diana was malicious and not calculating in the way that Marcus was calculating, but who had a talent for existing at the center of other people's resources without ever appearing to take anything, who left situations looking victimized even when she was the direct cause of the damage, who had cried so convincingly at Vivian's father's birthday dinner, the year Vivian's company was being dismantled, that 3 of Leonard's oldest friends had privately suggested to Leonard that perhaps his daughter needed professional help for what appeared to be a pattern of destabilizing behavior. Celia was the most dangerous of the 3, Vivian now understood, precisely because she was the most invisible as a threat. She capped her pen. She had filled most of the legal pad. Outside her kitchen window, the city was beginning its pre-dawn rearrangement. A garbage truck somewhere 2 blocks east, a taxi horn, the particular quality of darkness that was starting to go gray at the edges. She had perhaps 5 hours before she needed to be in position. She drank the rest of her cold coffee, stood up, and went to her home office. There was a filing cabinet in the corner that held, among other things, the original copy of her grandfather's trust document. She pulled it out and sat at her desk and read every page of it twice, methodically, with the attention she had developed over 4 years of financial analysis training and 8 years of hindsight. By the time the sky outside was fully gray, she had found what she was looking for. Section 14, subsection C, paragraph 3. The contingent co-trustee powers that Diana would eventually exploit were not, as it turned out, unlimited. They were discretionary, meaning they required a specific set of conditions to activate, conditions that included a written request from the primary trustee supported by documented evidence of the primary trustee's diminished capacity to manage trust affairs. Leonard was not incapacitated. Leonard was simply, at this point in time, a man who had married a woman he loved and trusted her with things he should have been more careful about. But the amendment he was planning to authorize tomorrow morning would change the structure of the co-trustee clause entirely. It would remove the incapacity condition. It would give Diana standing as co-trustee regardless of Leonard's capacity, effective immediately upon signing, unless the primary trustee withdrew the request before the attorney filed it, which Leonard had the absolute right to do, which he would never do on his own initiative, which meant that someone needed to give him a reason to do it before 9 o'clock this morning. Vivian opened her laptop. She called him at 7:30 a.m., which was 45 minutes before Leonard typically left the house and 90 minutes before the scheduled meeting. She had spent the intervening hours drafting a document, not a confrontational document, not an accusation, but a comparative analysis. 3 pages, single-spaced, that laid out side by side the current trust structure and the proposed amendment and itemized, in the dry and precise language of estate law, exactly what each version did and did not protect. She had also, in those hours, pulled out the letter from Wallace Shen's attorney, the 2009 letter that flagged the co-trustee vulnerability, and photographed it with her phone. She had prepared, finally, a single printed page that contained one question in large enough type that Leonard could not skim it. Has your attorney explained to you that this amendment would remove the incapacity requirement from the co-trustee activation clause and grant Diana Shen immediate and full discretionary access to an $18 million principal balance? Leonard answered on the 3rd ring. Vivian? His voice had the slightly cautious warmth it always carried when she called without advance notice. The warmth of a man who wanted to be close to his daughter and had never fully understood why it kept not quite working. It's early. I know, she said. I'm sorry to call before your day starts. I just want to ask you something quickly before your 9 o'clock. A pause. Small, but she heard it. How did you know about the 9 o'clock? Dorian Kwan is a junior associate at Castleton and Marsh, Vivian said. He mentioned you were meeting with the estate division. I'm not upset that you're updating the documents. It makes sense. Diana's your wife. I just want to make sure you have all the information before you sign. Another pause, longer this time. She could hear him thinking, could picture him in the kitchen, standing by the counter with his coffee, doing the mental calculation she had watched him do dozens of times, the one where he tried to determine whether the thing he was feeling was his own instinct or Diana's version of events. What information? He said. The amendment removes the incapacity clause, she said. Right now, for Diana to act as co-trustee, you'd need to be documented as incapacitated. That's the protection your father built in. The new language removes that condition. It gives Diana co-trustee standing starting the day you sign. Silence. That means she can authorize distributions from the principal, Vivian continued, keeping her voice even, factual, the tone of someone presenting a quarterly report, rather than fighting for 8 years of her financial life. Without your signature, starting now. That's not... He stopped. Started again. That's not what she told me the meeting was about. I know, Vivian said. I think it's possible she didn't understand the full scope of the language, or maybe it wasn't explained clearly. I'm not suggesting she has bad intentions. I'm saying that the document, as drafted, creates a situation that I don't think either of us want, because it means the principle of grandfather's trust becomes accessible to someone other than the primary trustee without any condition. That's not what he built it to do. She waited. She had learned over 8 years of boardrooms and courtrooms and dinner tables that the most important skill in any negotiation was the ability to be quiet, at the exact moment when silence became uncomfortable for the other person. Leonard said, I need to make a call. I'll email you the sections. Take your time. She sent him 3 documents, the comparative analysis, the photograph of the 2009 attorney's letter, and the page with the single large question. She sent them from her personal email with no CC addresses and a subject line that read, For your review before this morning. Then she sat back and waited. He called again at 8:15. I'm postponing the meeting, he said. He sounded tired, not angry. Leonard rarely expressed anger directly, but tired in the way a person sounds when they have just had a conversation that cost them something. The attorney agrees there may have been a drafting issue. We're going to review the language. That's probably wise, Vivian said. Diana is... He stopped again. She wants to talk to you. I'm sure she does, Vivian said pleasantly. Tell her I'll call her this week. She would not call Diana this week. She would not call Diana for several weeks. And when she did call, it would be brief and warm and entirely uninformative because Vivian had spent the last several hours planning, and she had decided, with considerable care, what her strategy for the next several years was going to be. She was not going to fight the trust amendment. She was going to let it happen. Not this version. Not this morning's version, which was too obvious, too large a step. But she was going to let a more modest version of it happen, the kind that Diana would find acceptable as a compromise, the kind that looked like Vivian had partially won. She would agree to a limited amendment that gave Diana nominal co-trustee standing, but preserved, through specific language Vivian would quietly insist upon, a supermajority requirement for principal distributions above $50,000. That requirement would not stop Diana. Diana was patient, and Diana was resourceful. And Diana would, over the next 3 years, construct a series of distributions that each stayed just below the threshold. Vivian knew this because she had watched it happen the first time. The difference was that this time she would know it was coming. And by the time the trust fund had been fully depleted, which, by her calculation, would take approximately 4 years, Vivian intended to have built something worth considerably more than $18 million. She called Dorian Kwan at 8:45. "I never called you back," she said when he picked up. "I know, I'm sorry, I want to fix that." Dorian's voice had a particular quality that she had always found reliable, a kind of careful precision that his friends sometimes mistook for coldness, and that Vivian recognized as its opposite, as the quality of a person who took ideas seriously enough to be exact about them. They had studied together twice a week for most of their second year, working through the same financial modeling frameworks, and she had noticed then that he had a quality rare in people who dealt in numbers. He could see the ethical architecture of a financial structure the way some people could see the load-bearing walls of a building. "You're calling early," he said. "I have a project," she said. "I want to talk to you about it in person. Are you free this evening?" "What kind of project?" "The kind that requires a corporate attorney and a financial analyst to work together from the beginning before anything is structured," she said. "I want to build a company. I want to build it correctly, which means I want the legal architecture in place before I bring in a single dollar of outside capital, and I want to do it quietly." A pause. She could hear him considering. "Quietly how?" he said. "Quietly in the sense that I don't want my name on anything for the first 12 months. She said. "I want a shell structure. Clean, legal, fully compliant with disclosure requirements, but organized so that the operational entity is not traceable to me in any public filing until I'm ready for it to be." Another pause. "That's a specific ask." "I'm a specific person," she said. "I'll explain everything tonight. If you're not interested after you hear it, I'll understand, but I think you will be." She heard him exhale, the careful kind of exhale. "Rivington Street, that wine bar on the corner, 7 o'clock. "I'll be there at 6:50, she said. She wore a gray blazer over a white shirt and flat shoes, and she arrived at 6:48 and chose a table near the back where the light was poor and no one from either of their professional circles was likely to sit. She ordered water and cheap house red, the kind of wine that tasted like ambition before it tasted like anything else. And by the time Dorian arrived, 3 minutes after 7, she had covered the paper tablecloth with a rough outline of what she was building. He sat down. He looked at the tablecloth. "Financial forensics," he said, reading. "Specifically corporate financial forensics with a subspecialty in trust and estate structure analysis," she said. "There's a gap in the market. High net worth families and small institutional investors who suspect financial irregularities in trust structures or private corporate arrangements, but who can't access the large forensic accounting firms because those firms have minimum engagement fees that start at $500,000. The mid-size market is completely underserved." Dorian poured himself a glass of the house red. He had the kind of face that processed information visibly, not transparently, but like the surface of water over movement below. He was quiet for a moment. "You want to help people investigate their own trust documents?" he said. "I want to help people understand what's actually in their trust documents," she said. "And what might be being done with the money in those trusts without their full knowledge. It's not just trust analysis. That's where we start. But the real market is us. in uncovering financial patterns that suggest unauthorized distribution, misappropriation of trust principal, or fraudulent amendment of estate documents. The forensic piece. That's a niche practice, he said. It's a niche practice that every single estate attorney in this city has seen at least 3 times in the last calendar year, she said. There is no shortage of wealthy families where one party understands the legal architecture of shared money and the other party does not. The party that doesn't understand it almost always loses. I want to build something that changes that ratio. He looked at her for a moment. Why do you need the shell structure? Because I have a trust fund, she said, keeping her voice matter of fact. And the co-trustee of that trust fund is my father's wife. And I've recently become aware that there are discussions happening about the structure of that trust that concern me. If I build a company and my name is attached to it, the company becomes an asset that the co-trustees' attorneys might argue is accessible to the trust's distribution framework, depending on how the amendment language ultimately reads. Is the amendment going forward? A version of it, she said, a more limited version than what was originally proposed, but I'd rather have the corporate structure clean and private before anything is finalized. Dorian turned his wine glass by the stem, once, twice. If you're building a forensics practice, you need a CPA, preferably one with a forensic accounting certification. Do you have someone? Not yet, she said. Do you? My sister's partner just finished her CFE certification, and she's been doing document review for a large accounting firm for 3 years. She's been looking for a reason to go independent. He looked up. She's not cheap. I'm not looking for cheap, Vivian said. I'm looking for excellent. Her name is Priya Anand. She's thorough, she's discreet, and she has a particular ability with financial document reconstruction, which I assume is relevant to what you're building. Very, Vivian said. He leaned back slightly. What's the timeline? I want the corporate structure filed within 60 days, she said. Operating agreement, shareholder arrangement, the shell company designation. I want to be actively taking clients within 5 months. I want to be profitable within the first year. That's aggressive. I'm aware, she said. I also know exactly what the first 3 clients are, which reduces the timeline for acquiring revenue. I have specific families in mind, people I know through my grandfather's network who have been looking for exactly this kind of service for years, and who will engage immediately if approached correctly. Dorian was quiet for a long moment. The wine bar had filled up around them while they talked. Young professionals, a couple arguing in low voices near the bar, a table of 4 women celebrating something, and the noise had risen to a comfortable buffer. You've thought about this for a while? He said. I've had a long time to think about it, she said, which was true in a way that he would not be able to fully appreciate. I'll call Priya tomorrow, he said. And yes, I'm in. She picked up her wine glass. Good. They clinked glasses. The cheap red tasted exactly like she'd expected, flat and slightly acidic and good enough. The limited trust amendment was signed 2 months later. Vivian attended the meeting with Leonard's estate attorney and presented, with pleasant, measured precision, the counterproposal she had drafted with Dorian's help. Diana would receive co-trustee standing, effective immediately, but distributions from the principal balance would require either both trustees' signatures or a documented written request from Diana with a 72-hour review period for Vivian to formally object. Diana, seated across the conference table in a camel-colored jacket and a smile that did not reach her eyes, accepted the counterproposal after 40 minutes of negotiation. Vivian watched her accept it and felt nothing except the quiet, efficient satisfaction of a mechanism clicking into place, because she knew what Diana knew and was pretending not to know. The review period clause was nearly useless in practice. 72 hours was enough time for an objection to be filed, but not enough time for an objection to be adjudicated, which meant Diana could make a distribution, absorb Vivian's objection as paperwork, and proceed with the funds before any court had a chance to weigh in. Over time, with repeated distributions, the pattern would be difficult to reverse. Vivian's objections would accumulate in the file and go largely nowhere, because each individual distribution would be defensible as within the co-trustees' discretionary authority under the language they had just agreed to. Diana had understood this immediately. The 40 minutes of negotiation had been performance, giving Vivian the appearance of a concession while retaining the operational reality of full access. What Diana did not know was that Vivian also understood this. What Diana did not know was that Vivian was not in this meeting trying to protect the trust fund. She was in this meeting establishing a paper trail, because every distribution Diana made over the next 4 years was going to be documented. Every distribution was going to be accompanied by a formal written objection filed by Vivian. Every objection was going to contain specific language noting the pattern of distribution, the cumulative total, and the apparent purpose of each disbursement. And those objections were going to be dated and filed and stored in a very specific way, the way you file documents when you're building a case. She shook Diana's hand at the end of the meeting with a warm and professional grip and said she was glad they could find an arrangement that worked for everyone. And then she walked out of the building and into the October air and took out her phone and texted Dorian one word: filed. His response came in under a minute. Good. Priya wants to meet Thursday. Vivian spent the next 6 months building 2 things simultaneously in the way that she had learned over 8 years that she was now living in reverse, to build things, visible and invisible. The visible thing was her professional life as the rest of the world understood it. She worked part-time for a small investment advisory firm downtown, a position she had taken specifically because it gave her access to financial databases and professional networks. Without requiring her to expose anything about the company she was quietly constructing on evenings and weekends, she attended the professional development events that her circles expected her to attend. She had dinner with her father twice a month and was pleasant and undemanding and gave Diana no reason to feel that she was being monitored. She went to Celia's birthday party in February, which was held at a restaurant in the Arts District and attended by approximately 60 of Celia's friends and acquaintances, most of whom were in the fashion and design industries and who regarded Vivian with a kind of polite curiosity, the way people regard a relative of someone interesting who has not themselves become interesting. Vivian wore a navy dress that she had bought on discount and drank exactly 2 glasses of wine and helped Celia open a gift whose wrapping had gotten tangled and genuinely laughed at the jokes Celia made about it. She was not performing warmth. She was not, in any conscious moment of the evening, executing a strategic objective. She was 23 years old at a birthday party. She was a person who could hold complexity, who could know what she knew, and still be capable of an honest laugh. She had decided, somewhere in the weeks after her rebirth, that she was not going to become the thing they had almost made her. She was not going to spend the next several years being cold and distant and visibly strategic, because that was not who she was, and because, practically speaking, it would have made everything harder. The invisible thing she was building was Meridian Analytics, LLC, which Dorian had incorporated under a Delaware holding structure that named him as the registered agent and an entity called Whitfield Strategic Partners as the initial capital investor. Whitfield Strategic Partners was, in turn, a Wyoming LLC with a single member whose name appeared in the filings as a trust, and who had been established with the assistance of a specialty corporate attorney Dorian knew from law school. The single member was Vivian. The Wyoming structure was entirely legal. The opacity was not deception. It was a standard corporate privacy mechanism used by thousands of operating entities across the country. It was, specifically, the same structure that Marcus Hale would use 3 years later to hide assets during the fraudulent transaction investigation he would file against her, which meant that Vivian was now building with the tools that would later be used against her, which she found darkly satisfying in a way she did not try to articulate. Priya Anand had turned out to be everything Dorian had suggested. She was 31, compact and precise in her movements, with the kind of focused intelligence that expressed itself not in rapid speech, but in the specific quality of her questions. When Vivian explained the first client engagement, a family in the northern suburbs, whose patriarch had died and left a trust whose distributions seemed inconsistent with the documented intent, Priya had asked 4 questions, all of them surgical, all of them pointing directly at the exact vulnerability Vivian had identified. They had charged the family $40,000 for a 60-day engagement that resulted in a documented finding of unauthorized trust distribution by the co-executor, an opinion letter from Dorian supporting grounds for litigation, and a referral to a senior estate litigator who had successfully recovered 2/3 of the misappropriated principal before the case settled. The family had paid without complaint. They had also, within 6 months, referred 2 other families to Meridian without being asked. Because the particular pain of financial betrayal, money taken from you by someone inside your own domestic circle, creates a specific kind of loyalty to the people who help you name and document and survive it. By the end of month 8, Meridian had 5 active client engagements. By month 12, they had 19. By month 18, they had a wait list. Vivian had, at the end of the first year, paid herself exactly $47,000 in salary. She had taken everything else and put it back into the company, into Priya's salary, into a second forensic analyst she hired in month 10, into database subscriptions and professional certifications, and the very specific and expensive legal infrastructure that Dorian was building around the entity to ensure that it was protected from exactly the kind of attack that Marcus had eventually leveled against her first company. The trust fund distributions, meanwhile, had begun. The first one came in month 3. $68,000, authorized under the co-trustee clause, designated for what the distribution form listed as family investment in emerging creative enterprise. Vivian filed her formal written objection within 72 hours, exactly as the agreement specified, detailing in 3 clean paragraphs that the designation was insufficiently specific, that no documentation of the creative enterprise had been provided, and that the distribution had the appearance of benefiting a related party, specifically the co-trustee's daughter, rather than the trust beneficiary. Diana's attorney responded with a 2-page letter asserting that the co-trustee's authority was clearly established under the amendment, and that the objection had been noted and would be filed. The objection was filed. In Vivian's records and in the system she had built with Dorian to track each transaction, it was indexed against a growing document set that included the distribution form, the response letter, the trust amendment language, and a running analysis that Priya updated quarterly showing the cumulative pattern of outflows and their apparent purposes. The second distribution came 6 weeks later. The third came the month after that. By the end of year 2, 22 separate distributions had been made, totaling slightly over $2 million. Vivian had filed objections to each one. She had not gone to court. She had not confronted Diana. She had not said a word to Leonard beyond, at one Sunday dinner, a mild and passing inquiry about whether he had reviewed the most recent trust statement. Leonard had said he was sure everything was in order. Vivian had nodded and passed him the bread. Diana, watching her from across the table, had a look in her eyes that Vivian recognized. The look of a person who has been watching for a countermove and is beginning to feel unsettled by its absence. Diana was not stupid. Diana had expected resistance. Diana had prepared for resistance, had built, Vivian suspected, a set of preemptive arguments and legal maneuvers designed to deflect a frontal challenge to the distributions. What Diana had not prepared for was quietness. What Diana had not prepared for was the woman across the dinner table who smiled at her pleasantly and seemed genuinely interested in how Celia's design work was progressing and who appeared, as far as anyone could tell, to be simply living her life. Marcus Hale arrived at Vivian's professional life in year 2 exactly as she had known he would. He was, in this life as in the last, immediately compelling. Dark-haired and expensively dressed in the careless way of someone for whom expense had always been invisible, with a directness of eye contact that most people read as confidence, and that Vivian now read as calculation, the particular focus of a person who was always, on some level, assessing what you were worth. He had approached her at a professional networking event, one of the large quarterly gatherings that the Downtown Business Association hosted in a hotel ballroom with adequate wine and indifferent canapes, and the persistent low hum of people trying to determine whether each other was useful. He had introduced himself as the founder of a data analytics firm that was expanding into financial services consulting, and had said, with the specific precision of someone who had researched her in advance, that he had heard she was doing interesting work in the forensic analysis space. In her first life, she had found the research flattering. In this one, she found it informative. She was pleasant, she was engaged, she allowed him to buy her a glass of wine, and asked him 3 specific questions about his firm's structure. The kind of questions that sounded conversational, but were actually diagnostic. The kind she now knew how to ask after 2 years of building a practice that depended on reading financial structures for hidden weaknesses. He answered smoothly, confidently, and with 2 specific omissions that she noted and filed away. She did not, then or in the following weeks, allow him to see anything real. She gave him her card. She met him twice for coffee. She listened carefully as he outlined, with increasing specificity, a joint venture proposal that would combine his firm's client base with Meridian's forensic capacity, creating an integrated financial intelligence practice that he projected, using numbers she recognized as largely aspirational, would generate $20 million in annual revenue within 3 years. In her first life, she had said yes. In this life, she said, "Send me the draft term sheet and I'll have my attorney review it. I want to make sure we're structuring the attribution correctly before I commit to anything." The attribution conversation, who would own what percentage of the revenue generated by each party's contribution, was, she had eventually understood, the entire point of Marcus's proposal. He had no intention of contributing equivalent value. His intention was to attach his brand to her methodology, take a controlling stake in the joint entity, and then, when the forensic practice was generating significant revenue, document the arrangement in a way that made him the primary contributor and her a minority partner. It was, in hindsight, an elegant theft, the kind that looked like opportunity until the moment it looked like a courtroom. The term sheet arrived 3 days after their second coffee. Vivian sat down with Dorian that evening, and they read it in its entirety, with a bottle of moderately better wine than the house read from the first meeting, and Dorian's tablet open to the corporate law database he paid for out of professional necessity. "This attribution clause," Dorian said, pointing to page 4. "I see it," Vivian said. "He's defined joint intellectual property to include any forensic methodology developed by either party during the term of the agreement, which is a 3-year term, which means that if Meridian develops a new analytical framework during the joint venture, it becomes co-owned. Including the framework I've already been developing for 6 months before this term sheet appeared," Vivian said. Dorian looked at her. He included a retroactive application clause. I almost missed it. It's in the definition section, not the IP section. He turned the tablet so she could see the language. It says, "Methodology developed in the preceding 18 months shall be considered in scope if it is deployed within the venture." 18 months, Vivian said. "Meridian has been operating for just over 18 months, Dorian said. "I know," Vivian said. She picked up her wine glass. "He researched the founding date." Dorian was quiet for a moment, in the particular way he was quiet when he was deciding whether to say something direct. "Vivian, he's not just proposing a joint venture," she said, saving him the need to arrive at the conclusion on his own. "He's trying to acquire Meridian's methodology through a contractual structure that makes the acquisition look voluntary. If I sign this, I spend 3 years building revenue under a joint entity that he co-owns, and at the end of the term, he has legal standing to claim co-ownership of the core IP and either force a buyout of my stake or restructure as a majority holder. And the retroactive clause means that even if you decline to renew after 3 years, he has a basis for claiming ownership of frameworks you developed before the venture started," Dorian said. "Counter-proposal," Vivian said. "No retroactive IP clause. Attribution based on origin documentation with a timestamp registry. Revenue sharing capped at 20% of any cross-referred client revenue, which is the actual value he's adding. No joint entity. A formal referral agreement instead of a merger." Dorian wrote it down. "He won't like the cap." "I know," she said. "I'm counting on him not liking the cap." She was, specifically, counting on Marcus's response to the counter-proposal to tell her something she needed to know, how far he was willing to go, and how quickly. In her first life, she had never given him a counter-proposal because she had signed the original term sheet without reading it carefully enough. This life, the counter-proposal was going to serve as a diagnostic. His response arrived in less than 24 hours, which told her that he had been waiting. It was not a revision. It was a new term sheet in which the retroactive IP clause had been removed, but the joint entity structure had been made even more controlling, with a provision that gave the managing partner, which the agreement defined as him, unilateral decision-making authority on client acquisitions above a certain revenue threshold. She did not respond. She waited a week and then sent him a brief email that said she appreciated the revision, but that she had decided the joint entity structure was not the right direction for Meridian at this stage of its development, and that she hoped they might find other ways to work together in the future. He called her within an hour. She did not answer. He sent a follow-up email that was professional and warm and contained in the final paragraph a phrase that she remembered verbatim from 8 years ago, the phrase that he had used in every negotiation when he felt something slipping away from him. "I just want to make sure you're making this decision with full information." She filed the email. She would need it. Later, over the following 18 months, Marcus approached her twice more with variations of the same proposal. Each time she reviewed it with Dorian, found the specific mechanism through which he was attempting to acquire control, documented her rejection clearly and professionally, and filed everything. The documentation was not incidental. The documentation was the work. Because Vivian had known for 2 years what Marcus would eventually do when he ran out of legitimate approaches. She had known since the morning she woke up on her bathroom floor and wrote his name on the right-hand column of a yellow legal pad under the heading Vectors. She was waiting. In the 3rd year, Meridian grew to 16 full-time employees. Priya had built a team of 4 analysts below her, each with either a CFE certification or a forensic accounting background. And the practice had expanded into 3 practice areas: trust and estate forensics, which remained the core; corporate financial forensics, which served small businesses and private investors; and litigation support, in which Meridian provided expert analysis and testimony to attorneys handling financial fraud cases. The litigation support practice had been Dorian's idea, floated at one of their now monthly dinners, after he had referred a client to Meridian for trust analysis and observed Priya present her findings in a client meeting with the particular clarity and confidence of someone who was not afraid of being cross-examined. "She should be testifying," he'd said. "She's not a licensed expert witness," Vivian had said. "Not yet," he'd said. Priya had obtained her expert witness qualification 9 months later, and the first 3 litigation engagements she had taken had all resulted in favorable outcomes for the parties Meridian supported. Outcomes that generated case study documentation that Dorian had converted into a quietly circulated white paper distributed to a targeted list of estate litigators and corporate attorneys across the city. The white paper had not mentioned Meridian by name. It had been attributed to an anonymous forensic practice. Dorian had listed his firm's contact information at the bottom. The referrals had tripled inside 6 months. Vivian spent most of her working hours during year 3 doing 2 things: client work, which was substantial and demanding, and which she found genuinely satisfying in the way that precise technical work is satisfying, and the slow, incremental process of building the evidence set that she was going to need for what came next. The trust fund had now been drawn down by approximately $6 million over 3 years. Vivian had filed objections to each distribution. She had also, through a research process that had taken Priya's team the better part of 2 months to complete, been able to document the destination of the funds with considerable specificity. Celia's fashion label, Caldwell House, which had launched with a press event that Vivian had attended wearing a pale gray dress that cost her $200 from a downtown sample sale, had received direct infusions from the trust distributions totaling approximately $3 million. The remaining $3 million had been distributed through what appeared to be a personal investment account in Diana's name, but whose transaction trail, when followed carefully through the financial forensics methodology that Priya had been refining for 3 years, showed a pattern of transfers into accounts connected to real estate holdings that were legally titled in a name Vivian did not immediately recognize. She brought the finding to Priya on a Wednesday morning. Priya studied the transaction map for a long moment. "This name," she said, pointing to the recurring destination account name, "Helmont Properties." "I've looked it up," Vivian said. "It's a real estate holding company registered in Delaware, single managing member." "Who is?" "A person named Adrian Caldwell," Vivian said. "Diana's brother." Priya looked at her. "Diana has been using trust distributions to fund her brother's real estate portfolio," Vivian said. The transfers are structured to stay below reporting thresholds. Each individual transfer is under $10,000, which keeps them below the federal currency transaction threshold. But the cumulative total over 3 years is approximately $2.8 million. Structured transactions to avoid reporting requirements, Priya said quietly. That's not just a civil matter. No, Vivian said. It's not. She had known this was coming. She had not known the exact structure. In her first life, she had never had the forensic capability to trace the money this precisely, but she had suspected that Diana was moving funds to a related party, and the specific mechanism Priya had uncovered was, if anything, more clearly actionable than what Vivian had imagined. Structuring, deliberately breaking up transactions to stay below reporting thresholds, was a federal financial crime. It did not require proof of the underlying predicate offense. The act of structuring was itself illegal. I need you to compile a full transaction analysis, Vivian said. 3 years of distributions annotated against the trust document language with the destination account mapping. I want a clear narrative document that a non-financial reader can follow from the trust amendment to the current balance to the Helmont transfers. How long? Can you have a draft in 3 weeks? 2.5, Priya said, which was why Vivian had hired her. It was during the drafting of that analysis on a Friday evening when the office was quiet and she was working through the final document review alone that Marcus moved. She didn't know it immediately. What she received first was an email from a financial database service that she used for client research, notifying her of an unusual pattern of access attempts on her account from an unrecognized IP address. The attempts had not been successful. The two-factor authentication she had set up had blocked them, but they had been made. She called Dorian. How serious? He said. I don't know yet, she said, but I want to know who the IP belongs to. It took Dorian's contact in cybersecurity 48 hours to trace it. The IP resolved to a virtual private network that was not commercially available, but was consistent with a type of service used by certain private investigation firms. Private investigation firms were, in Vivian's experience, hired by people who needed financial information they couldn't obtain through legitimate means. She thought about Marcus. She thought about the 3 rejected joint venture proposals and the 18 months of patient non-response and the phrase, I just want to make sure you're making this decision with full information. She thought about the version of this story she had already lived, the frozen accounts and the fabricated transaction records, and the corporate attorney with the relationship to Diana's divorce lawyer. She thought about the yellow legal pad and the word vectors. She called Priya. I need you to run a clean sweep of the client files, she said. I want a full audit of our internal systems, access logs, document download history, everything. And I want it done before Monday morning. Are we compromised? Priya said. I don't know yet, Vivian said, but I want to know everything we might be before someone else does. The audit came back clean. The database access attempts had not succeeded, but the forensic sweep of Meridian's systems revealed something more useful than what it had been looking for. A series of data requests from a corporate research service that had queried Meridian's corporate registration, operating history, and beneficial ownership documentation over a period of 6 weeks. Corporate research services were legitimate. Their reports were legal. But the pattern of the queries, the specificity of what had been pulled, the timing relative to Meridian's most recent client acquisition announcement, told a story. Someone was building a dossier on Meridian, and there were very few people with both the motive and the resources to do that. She had 2 weeks, she estimated, before whatever Marcus was building became actionable. She used those 2 weeks well. She completed the trust distribution analysis with Priya. She reviewed it with Dorian and 2 additional estate attorneys he brought in for fresh eyes. She had it formatted, bound and copied in 6 sets. She also, in those 2 weeks, completed a task she had been working toward for the better part of a year, the formation of Meridian's second corporate entity, a holding company called Solace Capital Partners, which had been structured from the beginning as the vehicle through which Meridian's intellectual property, its proprietary analytical frameworks, its methodology documentation, its client engagement templates, would eventually be held. The intellectual property transfer from Meridian's operating LLC to Solace Capital had been prepared by Dorian and reviewed by an IP attorney. It was dated 4 months back, which was legally accurate because the resolution authorizing the transfer had been passed 4 months ago and only the formal execution had been completed now. Everything Marcus might attempt to attach to Meridian's operating entity would find, if he looked carefully, that the most valuable pieces had been elsewhere for months. She signed the IP transfer documents on a Thursday night and sent Dorian the executed copies by courier. On Friday morning, Marcus filed a complaint with the State Financial Services Regulator, alleging that Meridian Analytics had improperly accessed confidential financial data belonging to two named entities during a client engagement the previous year. The allegation was false. Vivian knew it was false because she had been present for every step of the engagement in question, and because the confidential data Marcus was citing was publicly available through state corporate filings. She also knew it was false because she recognized it. She had seen this document before, 8 years ago, formatted differently and aimed at a different company, but the structure was identical. He was trying to create regulatory noise, not to win a regulatory finding, which, given the facts, he was unlikely to get, but to generate the appearance of a cloud over Meridian's operations, the kind of appearance that made prospective clients hesitant, that froze referral pipelines, that provided sufficient basis for anyone who wanted to attack Meridian's credibility to point to a pending regulatory matter. It was a move designed to work in a 60-day window. It needed 60 days of uncertainty to do its damage. She gave it 48 hours. She sent a response to the regulator's office through Dorian, a 12-page response that addressed every allegation in the complaint with specific factual documentation, including the public filing designations of every piece of data the complaint characterized as confidential, and a formal counterclaim asserting that the complaint appeared to constitute bad faith regulatory engagement, and requesting that the regulator note the pattern. The regulator's office issued a preliminary determination within 3 weeks rather than the standard 60-day window. The determination found no basis for the complaint and noted in its language that the data cited had been publicly available. The determination also noted in a single sentence in the third paragraph that the filing had been reviewed for bad faith indicators under the relevant statutory framework. That sentence was the sentence she had asked Dorian to push for. That sentence was a document she could use. She filed it in the evidence set, alongside everything else, and turned her full attention to the trust analysis and the meeting she had been waiting 2 years to have. She requested the meeting with Leonard through a formal written letter rather than a phone call, which she sent to him at the office address rather than the house because she wanted Diana to see that it was coming but not to know what it contained. The letter said that she had completed a comprehensive review of the trust's financial history and that she would like to schedule 90 minutes with him and his estate attorney to discuss her findings. Leonard called her the same day. He sounded, she noted, less tired than he had sounded in that phone call 2 years ago. That surprised her. And then it didn't, because she understood what the tiredness in his voice had been about. It had been about a moment of clarity. A moment when a man who was not dishonest had briefly confronted the possibility that something dishonest was happening around him. Clarity was exhausting. It was easier after the moment passed to return to the warmth. "What kind of review?" he said. "A forensic review," she said. "A full transaction analysis from the amendment date through the current quarter. I want to show you what's happened to the trust's principal and where the distributions have gone." Silence on the line. "I have documentation," she said. "I want you to see it. I'm not asking you to take any specific action. I just want you to see what I've found." "Vivienne," he said, and his voice had that quality again. Not tired, but careful, the kind of careful that comes from not wanting to arrive at a conclusion he couldn't come back from. "Dad," she said, keeping her voice even, keeping it warm, because she was not, had never been, trying to destroy Leonard. Leonard had made choices. Leonard had been careless with important things, but he was not the author of this. "I'm not trying to cause a problem. I'm showing you what's in your own documents. What you do with it is entirely your decision." He agreed to the meeting. She arrived with 2 copies of the bound analysis, one for Leonard, one for his attorney, and a third for herself. And she set them on the conference table and waited while Leonard and his attorney, a white-haired man named Gervis who had been managing the Shen estate for 20 years, looked at the cover page. Gervis opened his copy first. He turned to the transaction summary on page 4, which Priya had designed as a visual timeline. The kind of page that did not require financial training to understand, that made the pattern immediately visible to any reader who could track a line across time. His expression did not change in any dramatic way. It became more still. Leonard opened his copy more slowly. He read the cover page twice, then turned to the executive summary on page 2, which Vivian had written herself in the same tone she used for client reports: factual, clear, and free of any language that could be read as accusatory rather than analytic. The executive summary stated, over 36 months following the trust amendment, distributions from the principal balance total approximately $6 million. Of this amount, approximately $3 million can be documented as having been directed to Caldwell House, LLC, a fashion label owned and operated by Celia Caldwell, the co-trustee's daughter. Approximately $2.8 million can be traced through a series of structured transfers to Helmont Properties, LLC, a real estate holding company whose managing member is Adrian Caldwell, the co-trustee's brother. The structured nature of the transfers to Helmont Properties, each transaction falling below the federal currency transaction reporting threshold, is consistent with patterns associated with regulatory avoidance. She watched Leonard read that paragraph. She watched him read it again. Gervais set his copy down and looked at Vivian. "The Helmont documentation," he said. "How confident are you in the tracing methodology?" "The methodology is fully documented in Appendix C," she said. "The tracing was done by a CFE, certified forensic analyst, with 3 additional reviewers. The transaction trail is clean. Each step is documented with the corresponding bank record reference in the footnotes." Gervais turned to Appendix C. He read for approximately 3 minutes. Leonard had stopped reading. He was sitting with his copy open on the table in front of him, his hands folded on top of it, looking at something in the middle distance that was not in the room. "I want to be clear about what I'm asking for," Vivian said. "I'm not asking for the trust to be restructured. I'm not asking for any legal action. What I'm asking for is a full account of these transactions, provided by Diana and her attorney, with documentation that justifies each distribution as consistent with the trust's stated purpose. If there's documentation I haven't seen, if these distributions have been made for legitimate purposes that I'm not aware of, I want to see it." "And if there isn't," Gervais said. "If there isn't," Vivian said, "then we have a more specific conversation." The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Leonard did not speak for the first 40 of them, which was, in her experience of him, not silence. It was processing. When he did speak, it was to ask Gervais a single question. "What are my obligations here?" Gervais had been in estate law for 30 years. He answered carefully and completely, and what he said, in summary, was this. As the primary trustee, Leonard had a fiduciary obligation to the beneficiary, Vivian, to ensure that the trust was administered in a manner consistent with its stated purpose. If the distributions documented in the analysis could not be justified under that standard, Leonard had both a legal obligation to seek restoration of the funds and a potential personal liability for having authorized the co-trustee amendment that enabled the distributions. Personal liability. Leonard turned the phrase over visibly, the way a person turns a stone over to see what's under it. "How serious," he said. Gervais told him. Vivian sat with her hands folded on the table and did not let her expression change. Diana received a formal notice from Leonard's estate attorney 6 days later. The notice requested documentation for all distributions made under the co-trustee clause within 45 days, and noted that the primary trustee had retained an independent forensic accounting firm. Priya had agreed to serve in this capacity through Meridian at a formal rate to review any documentation provided. Diana called Vivian. "I want to talk," she said. Her voice was controlled, but there was something beneath the control that Vivian had not heard before. A brittleness, the specific texture of a person who has been operating under the assumption that a door is locked and has just discovered it isn't. "Of course," Vivian said warmly. They met for coffee, at Diana's suggestion, at a hotel cafe in the business district that was expensive in a neutral, impersonal way. Diana arrived in the camel jacket again, which Vivian suspected was a choice. Armor, a return to the costume of confidence. She looked polished. She also looked, around the eyes, like she had not slept well. "I want to explain the distributions," Diana said, Before Vivian had finished settling into her chair, "You don't have to explain them to me," Vivian said pleasantly. "You have to document them for Gervis and the independent reviewer." "I know what I have to do," Diana said with a sharpness she immediately contained. "I want to explain them to you because I think there's been a mischaracterization of—" "Diana," Vivian said quietly. Diana stopped. "The analysis was factual," Vivian said. "The transaction trail is documented." "What I've asked for is documentation that justifies the distributions under the trust's purpose. If that documentation exists, we provide it to Gervis and the independent reviewer, they assess it, and we proceed accordingly." She paused. "If it doesn't exist, then we're in a different conversation. And that conversation involves the federal structuring findings, not just the trust matter." She said it without emphasis, without heat, as though she were reading from a quarterly report. Diana held her coffee cup. She set it down. "Celia built something real," she said. "She needed support. Your grandfather's trust was built on family resources. It was always meant to support the family. The trust language specifies the beneficiary," Vivian said. "The beneficiary is me." "You didn't need it," Diana said. "You've built your own." "That isn't the legal standard," Vivian said. Silence. "The 45-day window is fair," Vivian said. "If you need help gathering the documentation, you should tell Gervis that, and he'll work with your attorney. I'd like this to be a process rather than an event." She picked up her own coffee. "That's all I came to say?" She left 40 minutes before Diana did. Celia called her 3 days later. That had not happened in Vivian's first life. Celia had never called her directly, had always operated through Diana, through Leonard, through the social dynamics of family events, never through the telephone in a direct and unmediated way. Vivian answered, "I didn't know about the Helmont transfers," Celia said. No introduction. Her voice was tight and very controlled, the way a person sounds when they are trying to prevent their voice from expressing what their face would be expressing if you could see it. Vivian believed her. She had, in the course of preparing the analysis, developed a fairly clear picture of who in the family circle knew what, and Celia's involvement appeared to be limited to Caldwell House, to the distributions that had funded the label, which Celia had almost certainly understood were coming from the trust, but which she may genuinely have believed were authorized. "I know," Vivian said. "The business—" Celia started, stopped. "I made decisions based on funding I believed I had. Some of those decisions are going to have consequences." "Yes," Vivian said. Another pause. "I'm sorry," Celia said, and then quietly, "I don't know if that means anything." Vivian considered that for a moment. Not strategically, just honestly. In the way you consider something when you are a person who has spent 4 years being careful and precise and cold analytical, and who has not forgotten that beneath all of it, she is 27 years old and the people she is fighting are people she has sat across from at dinner tables. "It means something," she said. "It doesn't change the process, but it means something." She hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of her office, and then turned back to the Helmont documentation on her screen. The 45-day documentation window closed without Diana providing adequate justification for the Helmont transfers. The documentation she provided for the Caldwell House distributions was partial. Some letters and projections that her attorney had assembled, none of it sufficient under the standard that Gervis and Priya were applying. The Helmont piece had no documentation at all, which told Vivian that Diana had been hoping the tracing methodology was wrong or incomplete, and had been recalibrating since the meeting when it became clear it wasn't. Gervis filed a formal demand for restoration of the misappropriated principal on behalf of the trust. The demand was accompanied by Priya's full analysis and the transaction documentation. Diana's attorney responded with a counter-proposal, a structured repayment plan for the Helmont distributions, the piece they could not explain, and a formal legal argument that the Caldwell House distributions were defensible under a broad reading of the co-trustees' discretionary authority. The argument was not strong. Dorian had reviewed it the same day it arrived and had written 3 sentences in the margin of his copy that together amounted to, "This is a position they're taking because they have no other position." Vivian let her attorneys handle the response. She turned her attention to the next phase. Meridian had been operating for 4 years. It had 16 full-time employees, a wait list, and a revenue trajectory that Dorian had modeled at the most recent board meeting. There was a board now, 4 people including herself and Dorian and Priya, and a retired federal financial crimes investigator named Constance, who Priya had recruited during the litigation support expansion at approximately $7 million for the current year. $7 million in its 4th year, built quietly, without a single dollar of the trust fund that had been drained behind her, without the joint venture that Marcus had tried to force, without any of the architecture that the people who had been watching her operate assumed she was relying on. She had done it in reverse. She had watched them take the money, and she had gone and made more. The company had been profitable since month 14. The intellectual property was clean, held by Solace Capital Partners, owned by Vivian Shen through a Wyoming LLC that was now 4 years old and had the documentation to prove it. The regulatory complaint Marcus had filed had been dismissed with prejudice. The dismissal, combined with the bad faith notation, had opened a door that Vivian had been patient enough not to walk through until she had everything else in order. She walked through it now. She filed a civil complaint against Marcus Hale, personally and through his corporate entity, for bad faith regulatory filing, tortious interference with Meridian's business relationships, and attempted fraud in connection with the 3 joint venture proposals whose IP clauses she had documented and filed over 2 years. The complaint was 12 pages, the exhibits were 47. She sent Marcus a courtesy copy 24 hours before the filing was entered into the court record, not as a courtesy, but because she wanted him to know it was coming, and she wanted the 48 hours of his response to be on record. He called Dorian's office 3 times. Dorian took none of the calls. She did not dramatize the filing. She did not discuss it at dinner parties or with mutual acquaintances or in any of the professional circles where the news would spread anyway, as it always does in professional circles, through the slow and inevitable process of people finding out things they were not specifically told. She was in the office the morning the filing went in, reviewing a client engagement report with Priya, drinking coffee. Not cheap instant, not anymore. She had discovered at some point in the last 4 years that she had opinions about coffee that she had been suppressing for reasons she could no longer remember. And when Dorian texted her entered, she looked at the message for a moment and then looked back at the engagement report and said to Priya, "Where were we?" The trust restoration proceeding concluded 14 months later through a settlement that required Diana and her attorney to negotiate with Gervis and Dorian simultaneously, which had been Vivian's preference because it meant Diana was managing 2 separate legal pressures with the same set of resources. The settlement restored approximately $4.3 million to the trust, the Helmont transfers in full, plus a portion of the Caldwell House distributions that Diana's attorney had ultimately been unable to defend under the standard Priya's analysis had established. The remaining Caldwell House distributions were addressed through a separate agreement in which Celia, who had retained independent counsel and approached Vivian's team through that counsel, agreed to a payment structure tied to any future revenue from Caldwell House. Celia's label had not collapsed in this version of events. It had not thrived. The brand had faced the natural difficulties of any early-stage fashion business, amplified by the legal proceedings that had become moderately visible in the industry press, but it was operating, which Vivian found she did not resent. She had not wanted Celia destroyed. She had wanted the money accounted for and the mechanism stopped. Both had happened. The co-trustee amendment was formally revoked as part of the settlement. Diana remained Leonard's wife, which was Leonard's choice to make and which Vivian had no interest in contesting. The remaining trust principal, approximately $12 million after distributions and restoration, reverted to its original structure under Leonard as sole trustee. The Marcus civil complaint was settled out of court on terms that included a financial payment, a non-disparagement agreement running in both directions, and a formal corporate dissolution provision that required Marcus's firm to cease operating under the name it had been using, which was close enough to Meridian's registered name that Dorian had included an additional trademark claim in the filing that had ultimately proved the most actionable piece of the complaint. The settlement was not public. Neither was what it represented in terms of what Vivian had recovered. Not only money, but something more specific. The kind of clean professional standing that is almost impossible to restore once it's been successfully attacked. She had not let it be attacked. She had moved first. On a Thursday in early December, 4 years and 2 months after she had sat on a bathroom tile at 2 in the morning and begun to understand that she had been given a second chance, not at love or family or peace or any of the large, soft things that people imagine they would pursue if they were given back their time, but at precision, at the chance to be more precise the second time than she had been the first. Vivian sat in the Meridian conference room for what had become a monthly ritual, the all-hands meeting where the team reviewed the quarter's work. The conference room had good light. It was on the 14th floor of a building she had signed a 5-year lease on in year 2, a decision that had seemed aggressive at the time and that she now considered obvious in hindsight, the way good decisions always became obvious after you'd made them. There were 16 people around the table, plus 4 joining by video from a satellite operation. Priya was standing up in a city 300 miles east, a city with a concentration of wealth management firms that had been generating consistent referrals for a year, and that now, Priya had decided, warranted a physical presence. Vivian looked around the table. Dorian at her left, reviewing something on his tablet with the focused precision she had learned to recognize as his version of relaxed. Priya at the far end, describing the satellite office build-out timeline with the particular efficiency of someone who has already solved a problem and is explaining it rather than working through it. The 4 analysts Priya had built around her, each of whom Vivian had interviewed personally and hired carefully, and had spent 4 years learning to trust in the specific and non-transferable way you learn to trust people who do precise work alongside you. The quarterly numbers were good. They were better than good. They were, in the language of the financial model Dorian had built and updated every 6 months, ahead of the year, 5 projection that had seemed ambitious when they'd written it, and now seemed, in retrospect, slightly modest. Vivian listened to the presentation. She asked questions. She wrote 2 notes on her legal pad. Not yellow. Anymore, not that particular artifact of a 2 a.m. crisis. She had moved to white for ordinary working purposes. And when the meeting ended, she stayed to talk to one of the junior analysts about a documentation issue he'd flagged in a client file. By the time she left the building, it was past 7, and the December street outside was cold and strung with lights, the kind of city cold that had a specific smell, concrete and coffee and the faint industrial edge of a million heating systems running simultaneously. And she stood on the pavement for a moment and let it settle on her face. Her phone buzzed. A message from Dorian. Year 5 projections are ready for your review. They're going to surprise you. She looked at the message for a moment. Then she put her phone back in her pocket and flagged a cab and got in. Where to? The driver said. Rivington Street, she said. The wine bar on the corner.